The image of the sorcerer, or the necromancer more specifically, is one of a perhaps singular character at the very fringes of society. They don black robes with a cowl to hide their face, and they carry about in tombs, crypts, and cemeteries, and they especially eschew the religious sensibilities of their age. They pore over vast tomes filled with strange diagrams, incantations in tongues older than memory, and they seek to control forces beyond the very powers of life and death, which exist at the limits of madness and soul-rending ferocity. The necromancer is a solitary character, hounded by religious authorities and demonic forces alike. In the end, their pursuit of knowledge beyond nature and power beyond right becomes their undoing. Torn asunder, they are spirited away to some hellish fate beyond all imagination. This image of the necromancer primarily comes to us from the Faust legend, from horror movies, the tales of people like H.P. Lovecraft, and games like Dungeons and Dragons. Roll for initiative. What do we really know about real historical necromancers? What if this stereotype is just wildly off the mark? What if necromancers weren't on the fringes of society, but in the court of popes and kings, and were well connected through a network of textual exchange all through medieval Europe? What if their rituals had more in common with a Christian mass than some forgotten eldritch rites? What if we knew all this because some of their manuals of black magic actually survive? In this episode, I want to dispel a few myths about real historical necromancy by taking a look at Brian Johnson's new edition, Necromancy in the Medici Library, where he wonderfully renders excerpts from a vast tome of real medieval black magic. I hope you'll join me as we explore the world of the medieval necromancers. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. One of the conclusions increasingly reached by scholars in the past generation is that the boundary between religion, magic, ritual, superstition, and similar terms is inherently blurry. Indeed, terms like magic, sorcery, superstition often have more to do with drawing social lines around what was considered socially acceptable by centers of power and authority than, well, anything else. What we do is religion. What you do, the other, well, that's magic or superstition. So before even getting started, we have to admit that a clear boundary between necromancy, magic, religion, exorcism, the ritual of the mass even, all blend together in these texts, both socially and ritually. And that brings us to our first point. Who were the necromancers? Well, we get a clue to their shadowy identity by the social and material culture of their books, but also from the trial records that have been left behind. I'll be doing an episode on the sorcery trials as opposed to the early modern witch trials in an upcoming episode, so check back for that. But now, let's look at some necromantic texts. The volume Brian Johnson works from is entitled on the spine Fasciculus Verum Geomanticarum, or a bundle of geomancy, which is a little odd for a title considering how little geomancy is actually present in the codex. Rather, the codex in question, or the book in question, is a substantial volume of about 325 paper folios in several humanist cursive hands containing numerous rituals, incantations, spells, or experiments, experimenta to use the language of the text. There's reference material such as sigils for astral bodies, magical circles, signatures for various demonic entities, various magical devices, and is currently housed in the Biblioteca Medici Laurenziana under the unassuming shelf mark Plut 89 Sup 38. In short, it's a necromancer's manual dating to the mid to late 15th century, likely produced in Italy, which even made its way into the library of the Medici Popes. All of this is actually instructive as to the identity of the author-compiler of this text. That the volume is on paper, an inferior material compared to vellum, tells us that the volume was produced on the economic end of the spectrum. But don't think that this was a cheap endeavor. The material supplied, such as paper, ink, etc., and the education to copy, amend, and generally produce such a text indicates a place at the lower end of the spectrum of the social elite, but social elite nonetheless. Books of any kind in the 15th century were very expensive, even if you transcribed them yourself. So we clearly have a literate person with a so-so pretty good understanding of Latin, although the scribe or scribes here aren't producing a terribly calligraphic text. The humanist hand is often very hurried and thus cursiva. The devices in the text are rather crudely drawn and done mostly freehand without much in the way of geometric tools, and various kinds of transmission mistakes in the copying, especially transposition errors, are all evidence of a work produced rather quickly. Further, and this is rather interesting, the text contains emendations, updating and altering the experimenta or the spells for substituting various kinds of ingredients, especially expensive ones like incense, as the experiments are planned or carried out. All in all, we can conclude that this is a working necromancer's spell book and not some whimsical collector's item to sit on a shelf. It wasn't meant to impress anyone for its artistic beauty. It was meant for the actual practice of its magical contents. We may glean that the compiler or the author of the text was male for both historical and social reasons, but also given the preponderance of erotic binding spells, or love spells as they're sometimes called, for capturing the affections of women. A particularly hideous spell involves sticking a pin into the foot of a corpse and then sticking it into the backside of a woman to prevent her from engaging in sexual activity. Apparently the same corpse foot pin placed underfoot at dinner, of course along with a few Aramaic magical words taken from the book of Daniel, also prevents people from eating at dinner. Now, I think you could probably accomplish this very same task by just telling your dinner guests that you have a pin that you recently stuck into the foot of a corpse. Also, random corpse foot. Other spells are variously antisocial as well and are meant to, induce insanity or generally cause harm to come to others. It's necromancy. It's black magic, of course. Now, if you've seen my episode on the Munich Necromancer's Manual, or CLM 849, some of this may sound familiar. Yes, of course, I have another episode about a Necromancer's Manual from the mid-15th century. Check it out in the card above and don't judge me. You're the one looking at a channel called Esoterica. The Medici Necromancer's Manual is actually rather typical of the time and cultural system in which it was produced. As much as Necromancer's Manuals are ever typical, I say typical in two respects. The first is that the religious system that underwrites the operative magic is fundamentally Christianity, especially the Latin Mass and the various exorcism rituals that were popular in the 15th century. The second is that not only do we find similar spells in other magical manuals of medieval black magic, but we also find basically identical texts. which strongly suggests a rather sophisticated network between necromantic texts and, by extension, the necromancers that wrote them. Let's treat these issues in turn by looking at one of the more macabre spells or experiments in the Medici manual. Starting at 294 verso, we have an experiment of Michael Scott, Necromancer. Scott, as you may recall from my episode on scholastic magic, link above, was an early 13th century mathematician and natural philosopher who quickly after his death became associated with all manner of occult arts, especially necromancy. It's probably going to happen to me. Indeed, by the composition of Dante's Divine Comedy, only about a century later, Scott is already condemned to hell for sorcery. Now, there's no doubt that Michael Scott had knowledge of the occult arts, but there isn't much evidence that he actually practiced them. Regardless, here we have a rather macabre spell or experiment for summoning a demonic tutor to quickly learn a vast range of knowledge, both occult and normie. This spell is classic black magic. Ritual purification and suffumigation, sacrificing doves and using their blood to paint magical circles and symbols, incubation or magical sleeping rituals, wielding various kinds of ceremonial swords, lofty incantations invoking demons and spirits and dead people, even testimony that Scott himself performed this experiment in Cordova to verify its efficacy. Now, I'm not going to go through the entire incantation. You can read it in really wonderful translations, link below. Make sure to support your local necromancer translators. But what I want to point out here is that under the hood of all the trappings of necromantic black magic are rituals and invocations which are fundamentally extracted from the world of Catholic ritual, especially the ritual of exorcism and scripture, especially that of the Mass, and especially the power of scripture, in this case, the Latin Vulgate. What's crucially important about all of this is that we often imagine the necromancer as someone who rejects or eschews dominant religious beliefs for some kind of fundamentally aberrant or heterodox religious alternative. That's just not what we find in actual historical texts of necromancy. The necromancers here fundamentally accept the dominant metaphysics of the day and only really make sense within the religious context. That's Catholic Christianity, and which these ideas, these rituals, are composed and performed. The binding of these various demons, for instance, is an extension of the power of Christ over the realm of the demonic via the magister or the necromantic operator. Now, I'm not going to pretend that this was part of a normative practice within Christianity. Clearly it wasn't, and the trial records of those condemned by the church for sorcery make that very clear in the fiery doom of those convicted. But what can't be denied is that the necromancer is laboring under a Christian worldview, using ritual power which extends from a fundamentally Christian metaphysical apparatus to wield their magical powers. While this form of necromancy may be incompatible with the normative Christianity of, say, the 15th century, or any century, it's impossible without just that Christian framework. All of this gives us a clue to the authorship or the practitionership question. Who would have all the skill sets required to create and practice this kind of necromantic magic? Well, some kind of clergy, probably in the lower orders, but almost certainly members of the clergy. Now, I know that Christian necromancer sounds like a contradiction in terms, but history just doesn't really give a damn about our preconceived categories. The second way in which I think the Medici Necromantic Manual is actually typical of the period, though still rather surprising, is just to the degree that we find typologically similar, sometimes even identical magical texts dispersed all over Europe. And the case of the Michael Scott experiment is helpful here as well. A nearly identical version, or at least as identical as such texts are given the realities of manuscript transmission in the 15th century, is actually found at the very beginning of the mutilated start of the Munich Necromancer's Manual, or CLM 849. Indeed, both of these necromantic manuals share a great deal in common, and sections of both, or of another text very similar to them both, were known to Trithemius, the tutor of Cornelius Agrippa of 3 Books of Occult Philosophy fame, who actually cataloged some of these spells that were in active use during his lifetime. Further, typologically similar, though not identical magic motifs of the Michael Scott experiment are actually found elsewhere as well, such as those using the demon Azazel to obtain a spirit of a dead teacher to teach the Magister various kinds of things, including the location of buried treasure, because Goonies never say die, y'all. Also, these books occur as far away as the Cunning Folks grimoires of England. Many such ritual, typological, and manuscript stemmatical similarities can be noted, all pointing to a substantial and sophisticated network of necromantic practitioners in medieval Europe. The mimetic and manuscript transmission, for instance, we find Italianized Latin words in the necromantic manuscript in Germany, point us in some sense to a geographic direction for that chain of transmission. Of course, this is just basically necessary to explain the contents of the texts that survive, and of course that's only a tiny fraction of what probably existed. And when you take all of this together, it basically demands the existence of what scholars like Kiekefer call the clerical necromantic underground. More cool band names from Esoterica. So, our image of the necromancer needs some revision. The necromancer here is certainly Christian, though they're engaged in rather heterodox practice, and they were likely set into a network where such knowledge is flowing through Europe along pretty complex forms of exchange across languages, cultures, and regional magical practices. They're also true experimentalists. These texts show practice-based editing, and that knowledge seems to get passed on and refined, for lack of a better word. Further, and I think this is really important about the elite social position of these books, they're ending up in rather high-end collections, like those of the Medici Popes, rather than just getting burned somewhere. These texts are informed by ritual practice, they're copied, edited, transmitted over hundreds of miles, then they're recollected, cataloged, and then performed by enough people for that chain to reach, in some form or fashion, almost all of Western Europe as we know it. Now, I'm not saying that all of these sorcerers got together for like Necronomicons or anything like that, but I suspect that at least part-time necromancers were actually relatively widespread in late 15th century Europe. Johnson's translation also includes a nice demonic catalog, including Paimon, who's recently gotten some nice Hollywood screen time. He must have a really good agent. I gotta get Paimon's agent. Of course, these demonic categories are fascinating to compare for reasons of manuscript transmission and their evolution over time. For instance, we have a text like this manual, we have similar texts in the French necromantic traditions, and then how these various demonic hierarchies are taken up into Weier's Pseudomonarchia Daemonorum, and then of course how they're all kind of synthesized into the very famous or infamous Lesser Key of Solomon in the Goetia. Just for this reason alone, I think Johnson's text it would be of special interest to practitioners of the Solomonic magical tradition, but it's also really interesting for us manuscript and mimetic magic transmission nerds, which I guess I am one of those nerds. Yes, clearly these demonological catalogs share some complicated internal relationship, from the French text to CLM 849 with its rather little brief demonological catalog, though the paucity of the evidence makes it all really difficult to piece together. The catalog section is also followed by another really nice section on astrological or astral necromancy, with rules which, interestingly enough, seem to clash with those preserved in the Vire text and are basically omitted in the Goetia for whatever reason. Again, this is all likely attesting to various lines of transmission and necromantic practice through various times and cultural systems as these manuscript and oral traditions permeate through Europe. All told, I can certainly say that Johnson's Necromancy and the Medici Library is a wonderfully great text for anyone looking to just get a sample of the magical practices of the Middle Ages, but I would also think it's necessary reading for anyone steeped in the world of Solomonic or ceremonial magic. The text is relatively inexpensive. It's only about $20 American. It's really nicely translated. It has a fantastic introduction and really great and helpful notes. It also has the Latin text facing, which is always nice to have the original text there. I'll also say that the manuscript itself is also pretty nice to flip through as well. The humanist hand isn't really hard to read. There's nothing compared to the cramped, abbreviated quadrata hand of the Munich Necromancers manual, and with some basic Latin, you can really appreciate the range of magical subjects covered in the original manuscript. I only hope one day that the entire 325 or so folio manuscript eventually gets the same careful treatment provided by Johnson in his translated excerpts. I've included a link to the full digital manuscript below if you want to flip through it. Also, look for a link below to pick up Johnson's translation. Again, if you're interested in necromancy specifically, make sure to check out my other episode on the Munich Necromancers Manual, or CLM 849, for a very extensive reading list and analysis of the necromantic magic in that volume. And in general, if you're interested in magic, hermetic philosophy, or the occult, make sure to subscribe and check out my other content on topics in esotericism. Also, if you want to support my work of providing accessible, scholarly, and free content on topics in esotericism here on YouTube, consider supporting my work on Patreon or with a one-time donation. You can find those links below, and I really deeply appreciate your consideration of supporting my work on the channel. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and you've been watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.